Welcome to the Carnivore Cast, a podcast focused on the carnivore diet and lifestyle, with practical advice from successful carnivores, citizen scientists, and top researchers. I'm your host, Scott Meslinski, and I'm here to speak with experts and experienced carnivores to get answers to your biggest and meatiest questions while helping you live your best life as a carnivore. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Sally Norton MPH is an expert in oxalates, a plant toxin found in many common health foods, such as spinach and almonds, that can cause many health disorders. Sally has a degree in nutrition from Cornell University and a master's of public health from the University of North Carolina. She managed a 5-year National Institute of Health funded program at the UNC Medical School. I had the pleasure of meeting Sally at Keto Fest in Connecticut, and she's as friendly, helpful, and excited as she is wise and ambitious. Sally's first episode, which you should definitely go check out, was a hit. It's the most listened to and downloaded episode of all time on the Carnivore Cast, and I'm very excited to have her back on. Welcome back, Sally.
Thank you, Scott. It's really fun to be here.
Yeah, and we were just chatting before the show, talking about the fact that it was our most popular episode ever on Carnivore Cast, and why that might be. So I have some thoughts on that, but I'd love to hear yours too.
Oh, well, I guess this is a real shock to most of us who've been trying to eat healthy for a long time to learn about oxalates, and that we're having a personal story wrapped around that. And I think the carnivore world has accidentally stepped into the mud puddle of the oxalate thing, because when you get off plant foods and you go on a meat-only diet, you've walked away from a lot of plant compounds, and the one that has the most power to tell you you've done so is the oxalate. So I think it rings true in people's lives, and it's making sense to them, and they're hungry to get a handle on it because we have so little understanding of it.
Yeah, I think you put it perfectly, that people have stumbled into this mud pile. And it's like, I think people are frustrated. I think there's two elements which are very related. One is people are frustrated that they've taken such giant steps to remove processed vegetable oils and sugar and grains from their diet and carbs, and they think they're eating all the right things. But some of the main culprit oxalate foods are still in their diet, things they thought were keto, healthy, great for them. And then two, there's always going to be the people for whom a certain dietary intervention doesn't work and they need to go further. So, just going keto would work fantastic for a lot of people, or just going low carb or eating whole foods. But then there's going to be this minority of people who need to dig in much deeper. And oxalates is a great example of that, probably a bigger example of that than other things. But, there's all types of things around thyroid and tweaking hormones and different interventions that people need to do where these general guidelines don't work. And often those people are the loudest and the ones who want to dig the most and need the most help and have the most health problems. So I think those are kind of two factors that have led to oxalates being so investigated and the information being so helpful in this community.
Yeah, it's so interesting that we're really lost in the desert of just unawareness of plant toxins. And I heard in what you were saying a sort of temptation to try to quantify, how many of us in our health is being affected by plant toxins, in particular oxalate. And we have no denominator. We have no way. And as I'm reading the literature and understanding its effects and looking at our public health data and how sick we are as an era, like human beings in the 21st century are struggling with lots of serious health problems. And of course, there's many assaults on our health, but of course, what we eat is that intimate day-to-day exposure, and what we're being taught is ignoring this huge area. So I really think that the majority of us, at one point or another, how well we're feeling, how well we're performing, and how well we're aging, and how long we live can very much be heavily influenced by the amount of oxalate that we eat.
Yeah, certainly. And maybe it'd be helpful for folks who maybe haven't listened to the first episode, or I guess it's been a while. It's been over a year now. If we could recap what oxalate is and how it works in the body, and then maybe some common high oxalate foods.
Right. So oxalate is the salt form of a acid called oxalic acid. And oxalic acid is all through nature. It comes down in the clouds and so on. But plants make a lot of oxalic acid, and it's useful to them. They can, oxalic acid binds minerals. So it's a chelator of minerals, particularly minerals with a double outer ring of sort of availability. So oxalic acid has this negative charge, and it gets attracted to things with positive charges, which includes things like calcium. And plants deliberately use oxalate to build crystals. They put out these matrices and build crystals with calcium oxalate, but they use the oxalic acid itself, the ionic form, to manage their life cycles and to defend themselves. So we eat a lot of the oxalate, both in the crystal form and in the acid or the soluble salt forms, which are the ones that are more easily absorbed into the bloodstream. So we eat it, we absorb an ion that grabs minerals from our body and promotes mineral deficiency by wasting a lot of calcium, magnesium, iron, and probably other minerals as well. And then as those calcium oxalate molecules build up in the body, if they get close enough to each other, they can become crystals by pairing up. And so a molecule that steals minerals and forms crystals is fundamentally deficiency creating and toxic. And it's not just the minerals either. The heavy oxalate in the body burns up B vitamins as well. So some of the things that it's doing to us is it's rough on the digestive tract. It's affecting mineral and ionic balance in the body, and it's forming crystals and potentially sticking in tissues and not leaving the body. Normally we would pee out, or, ideally anyway, we pee out at least 90% of the oxalate that we eat and absorb into the blood. But to get to the kidneys and get to the urine, that oxalate has to travel through our vascular system, mixing with the white blood cells and the other cells and tissues of the vascular system and bloodstream, and getting into the liver, the heart, the lungs, the peripheral tissues. It tends, because it's got a charge on it, either as a crystal or as an ion, it tends to stick to membranes and causes membrane disorganization, where the structure, where the molecules and membranes are, get moved and mess up membranes and so on. So that's a long answer. I think the big thing to realize is that accumulation of microparticles in the crystal form is a known toxic problem. And that is irritating to the body. The body needs to get rid of this stuff the best it can. And the parts of the body that deal with that are immune cells and endothelial cells. And you can get into endothelial cell dysfunction and immune cell dysfunction when you're constantly barraging it with something that's damaging them.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And can we talk about what some of the high oxalate foods are, Sally?
Yes.
Just like common culprits.
Common culprits would be the nuts, which are really popular now, and also peanuts, which are technically a legume. But most of us grew up on peanut butter and used peanuts for parties and snacking. And they're in an awful lot of sweets and desserts and snacks and, bars and things. And then there's potatoes and sweet potatoes. I mean, we all grew up on French fries and mashed potatoes and baked potatoes. And sweet potatoes have become really popular. They're even higher. But potatoes are high in the soluble form that is easily absorbed. So I would say peanuts and potatoes are the most universal source. And then there's bran and whole grains, which have been a promoted as healthy for over 100 years now. And there's black beans and white beans. There's chocolate, tea, and turmeric, kiwi, pomegranate, raspberries, and blackberries. And then in the greens, there's spinach, beets and beet greens, and Swiss chard. So I would say those are the top ones that are so high that they're troublemakers.
Yeah, it's amazing how many foods there are, and even someone who thinks they're eating really healthy, they could still have even just one of these foods in their diet and could be doing a lot of damage, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. I was like on the sweet potato kick when I got off my vegan diet. I realized I was also really sensitive to legumes and grains, and so I was trying to come up with a way to have some starch because, of course, you got to have carbs, right? So I was eating sweet potatoes every day. And so, yeah, it was better to be not vegan anymore, but it didn't really fix me to just put some meat back in the diet since I went from bread to potatoes. I mean, it was not an improvement.
Yeah, interesting. And why do oxalates release differently than other anti-nutrients? And what does that mean? Like so many foods, people are just trying to get healthier and they're like, just get this out of my diet. But it's a bit different with oxalate, isn't it?
Yeah, it is because of that tendency for those crystals to get hung up in our tissues. And sadly, this whole bioaccumulation problem where we're filling up with bad stuff that's hurting us, and it starts in fetal development where we're being exposed to all kinds of things as fetuses and often in a sort of nutrient deprived state. And we really haven't studied this from a medical point of view. Like we're not really devoted to the idea that we should support the body in being healthy all on its own. Our whole system of medicine has been skewed towards a pharmaceutical model that says all research should be able to culminate in a product that would help the pharma industry make us better. So we have that old philosophy, I think, that's really skewing where we spend our research dollars, and we just haven't put enough research into understanding bioaccumulations of these plant anti-nutrients, as well as just the basic man-made chemicals. You would have thought after 9/11 and those folks in New York who were so heavily poisoned, the first responders were all made quite sick from all the debris and chemicals and yuck that they were dealing with, trying to find any survivors in the 9/11 rubble. You would think that would have inspired more funding for toxicology research and what's accumulated in our bodies, how we can detox people and understand the long-term kind of clinical path and the long-term metabolic effects of toxicity. Unfortunately, we don't do that. So, but with oxalate, we have been finding these oxalate crystals in pathology studies for 100 years. And we know from a genetic form of this disease, because oxalate is also a byproduct of our metabolism. And the amount you produce in your metabolism depends on your nutritional status and what you're eating. Vitamin C is the precursor for oxalate. So people who've been taking lots and lots of high dose vitamin C may be generating an awful lot of oxalate that can become accumulations. So one of the problems is as long as you're still consuming either the precursors like vitamin C or these high oxalate foods like the potatoes or the chocolate, or the blackberries or the spinach, all of that stuff is going to kind of take precedent. The body has to deal with the incoming. And so it gets in this sequestration mode where it's got to kind of push it out of the way and hide it and keep the levels low enough in the bloodstream and low enough in the kidneys so that the kidneys can handle it. So the body is sort of putting stuff in the attic, you might say, hoping for the day when you quit the spinach or whatever it is your favorite high oxalate foods are, so it can eventually clean house. Unfortunately, we get into this delay and constant prevention of the cleaning house because we tend to eat these foods so routinely. You really need a minimum of 5 days just to tell your body that the coast is clear and you could go to the attic and start emptying. But it's so unusual to go 5 full days without oxalate in our food until we do something like go carnivore. And then for some people, boy, they feel great on carnivore for a few days and then not. Because if you're cleaning out the attic, you're bringing out all this junk out of your tissues, bones, tendons, thyroid gland. It can be anywhere. You start cleaning that out, and the amount of free oxalate that's now traveling around through tissues in the bloodstream, back in the kidneys, becomes quite high. And it could be worse than it was after a big green smoothie, which is really high, by the way, but it can be quite toxic. So, and sometimes the irony of this is that you could be higher in oxalate after you stop eating it in terms of the functional oxalate that's moving around, the little ions and nanocrystals that are the most toxic form. When the body sequestered it, it's wrapped it up and kind of buried it in a way so it's not interacting with tissues. But once you start trying to clean it out, it's now in its full toxic form.
Yeah, it's really crazy how you need to be very careful. And I thought it was really interesting. We went into this on our first episode together, but you articulate it so well that you really need to be careful and titrate out oxalates in the appropriate way, so as not to have these really severe reactions. It's just unlike any other anti-nutrient I know of, that it acts that way. So I think that can be really confusing for people. And can you talk a little bit about how I heard you mention this? I thought you went into it really well with Vanessa Spina on her show, Ketogenic Girl, how oxalate affects the immune system and can result in such a wide spectrum of autoimmune reactions, and even can cause like food sensitivities or reactions that maybe you didn't have before.
Yeah, so there's a lot of physiology in all of this, but if you just understand that you're eating crystals and you're eating this acid that's, caustic and hurts cells, and it's, first of all, it's harming your gut, and an awful lot of your immune function is happening in the digestive tract, right? So you're already risking leaky gut and constant inflammation in the gut. So right there, you're setting yourself up for autoimmune problems and food sensitivities, because you've got permeability in the gut. So not only is the cells in the gut unhappy and the gut tissues in distress mode and calling for additional help from the immune system, but it's happening also in the bloodstream and elsewhere where these compounds are getting into the blood that probably shouldn't. But from an oxalate specific point of view, you first got potentially turning up gut inflammation. Then you've got circulating monocytes in the bloodstream who are damaged within 40 minutes of taking a spinach smoothie, according to a research study by Tanisha Mitchell at the University of Alabama, demonstrated that. They measured the monocytes and could see this immune distress, that the monocytes are coming out of the bone initially, and that's another issue we'll get to in a second. They come out of the bone, they're not fully deciding what they kind of differentiate depending on their need later. So they come out with all this youthful potential to be different kinds of immune cells. Well, if they're getting damaged in their adolescence, you might say, it's going to affect how well they do when they're asked to show up at a sign of inflammation and damage. So somewhere in your body, you're going to need your immune cells because there's bacteria, there's viruses, there's oxalate crystals forming in your damaged shoulder rotator cuff that you've been abusing with your tennis or whatever, right? So because this is what oxalates do, they get hung up in tissues that are already damaged. So there's already the immune system acting on damaged tissues, trying to fix them, trying to keep them from falling apart or getting worse, and then trying to recover from that. So you potentially, if you're eating high oxalates routinely, the circulating monocyte has been already damaged by, let's call it the spinach smoothie. And then that circulating monocyte is showing up at a place where oxalate damage, say the gut or the liver or the heart or the thyroid gland, and it may not be working that well. And as you have a lifetime of eating high oxalate foods like I have, you have a very good chance of oxalate being in the bone and potentially in the bone marrow. Some people are great on collecting oxalate in certain body parts, and other people collect it in other body parts. But the bone marrow is a fairly common place for oxalate accumulation to start happening. So that teenage monocyte might have been born in the bone marrow near oxalate and have already been disturbed, and it's how well it's functioning, how much oxidative stress is going on, how well their mitochondria and so on are working in the cell. So even just the structure of the cell could be harmed, or the genetic expression of the cell by exposure to oxalate at birth during its sort of, you might call adolescence in the bloodstream, and then it's showing up to a site that has oxalate crystals and having to deal with it. So you've got every kind of life stage of immune cell and immune cell function, you have the potential to be having some oxalate damage to the cells themselves. The other thing is just the fact that the immune system gets turned on by oxalate and oxalate crystals. It keeps it turned on all the time when you're eating it all the time, keeping your immune system working overtime, work. That's a very costly to your body in terms of energetic resources and can create long-term changes, especially when you get these crystals, because the immune cells will come along and they'll try to phagocytize crystals, which means they try to bring them inside. They try to eat them. So hopefully the theory with the immune cell is it can eat this bad guy, whether it's a bacteria, a virus, or a oxalate crystal. But the crystals can be kind of too big, and this can cause what we call frustrated phagocytosis. And so the immune system will, if it's working well and not too confused by its damaged cells, we'll say, well, okay, we'll try, 10 of us will get together and we'll try to get it. No, that's not going to work either. Okay, we'll form a granuloma. So we'll wall this off and we'll contain this bad crystal by enveloping it with our carcasses, our dead DNA. They deliberately, in fact, one of many techniques of the immune system is to form something called a net. A net is these monocytes spit out their DNA and create this net or mass of DNA as a net, a trap to contain these crystals. And so you can wrap up your crystals in nets and dead white blood cells and so on. When the immune system knows to turn all that off, that's fine. If it doesn't know to turn it off, it can turn into fibrosis, which is a major kind of process, a disease process, where you end up with failing organs. Like some women, they get fibrotic uterus so bad they lose their fertility or lose their, they have to have a hysterectomy. And of course, fibrosis can be the death of you if it's your kidneys getting fibrotic, because these granulomas and this immune action in the kidneys is so constant that it takes down your kidneys. So, and then when it comes to just immune function in general, you've got the potential for leaky gut, and you have potential for a just overworked, confused immune system. And if your genetics, your individual history, your level of exposure, and other forms of metabolic stress are going on, it's going to influence, how severe and what tissues are affected. But a lot of us who are sort of allergy prone, we end up with severe food sensitivities going on. And I don't think we fully understand how all this works, but we do know that the leaky gut, the constant inflammation, and the learning that goes on. So it's your innate immune system that does a lot of this initial responding. It turns up inflammasomes and does all these cool things that we're learning about. We're really just learning about the immune system. I think our knowledge is in a primitive place, but we're in a good place with good technology and techniques. And we're learning more and more about the immune system to understand more. But fundamentally, what we see in this client population, those of us who've recognizing oxalate as an issue, we tend to have a huge number of sensitivities to plant foods and some animal foods. And it starts limiting our food choices. And carnivore is a really nice kind of refuge for a lot of us. We can find at least some meats that we do well on, and it helps the gut heal and helps calm this down if we just stop asking the immune system to be working overtime. The problem is what you brought up initially. Because this is hanging around, you're still exposed to oxalate. So you stop eating it, you're going to still be high oxalate for many years, potentially. So getting the immune system to completely unlearn this reactivity to all these foods and everything around us is going to take a while, because the immune system really isn't getting a break right away.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I had no idea that fibrosis could be related to all this. And it's just, the way you describe it is really fascinating to me. It's such a complicated web of interrelated factors and things that can affect the immune system. And it's really not as simple as cause and effect. which is why this is so important and so tough for people to figure out. And it's great to have people like you investigating this. And Sally, when we last spoke, you were talking about a book, and it was funny because we spoke in fall of 2019. You were like, when my book comes out in the spring of 2021. And I was like, oh, that's oddly specific. But I'm curious, are you still working on the book? You mentioned a manuscript.
I am just finishing up the manuscript now. And
awesome.
then the publisher has to take their crack at it, and we have to get it all lined up. And there's a lot of work to do to finally package a book, getting all your permissions and getting everything laid out right, and really deciding on the final. So it's probably not going to be spring, but certainly sometime in 2021, unless, who knows? I mean, it's really not in my hands completely because I'm going with a big publisher, but it feels like a sacrifice to do the book, even though I'm devoted to it 100%. I feel like it's my dying wish to die having left behind the book that attempts to do at least a lightweight treatment of 6 years of research and all that I'm learning and wanting to share with people as a warning to my fellow healthy eaters. Like, please don't make the same mistakes that I've made. If you want to be happy and healthy.
And what can people, to the extent you're able to talk about it, what can people expect from the book? How is it structured? Who's it for? I have multiple audiences that I'm concerned about. I'm especially wanting to throw out a life ring to people like me who want to be healthy and are looking for answers. I felt like when I figured out what was wrong with me, and with all my background in nutrition and public health and holistic healing and all my connections in the medical world and the alternative health world, I should have known better. And none of my connections, and nor me, knew what was wrong with me for decades. So I feel like I owe it to them to say, hey, no one's going to help you with this, but if you're willing to listen, you might consider this. And that's really, I'm not trying to convert the world to being afraid of oxalate. My real goal is to help people who need this and try to find a way to find them. But fundamentally, most of the folks who need help are asking their doctor for help. They're asking their naturopath for help, and their acupuncturist, and their massage therapist, and they're this, and they're that. And they're spending a lot of time and money pursuing advice from health providers. So they're also an audience, because I think once they start seeing this and they understand enough of the science, it makes complete sense. And it's not such a weird left-wing kind of, alien conspiracy theory. It's actually science. There's a ton of science here, and nobody's really put it together. So I'm trying to sneak in as much science as I can for both audiences. You are affected by this, and you're going to be able to make sense out of what's happening to you in your health if you've been damaged by oxalate, because you're going to understand enough of how this works. You're going to see enough of the science, and you're also going to feel confident in talking about it with Uncle Fred at the New Year's party, because you've got this book backing you up. Yeah. Yeah, that's really crucial, I think, for people, because it can feel alienating to have a small amount of knowledge about a topic, to know something is bad, to know you and you're trying to make improvements, you're trying to learn, but people can be very critical and defensive against new ideas. And I think oftentimes they're trying to protect their own emotions and feeling insecure about not knowing about these things. But having resources like yours and the book, which I'm very excited for, can equip people to feel more confident. And so when they face, negativity or, hey, everyone can eat sweet potatoes, what's wrong with that? Or something, these comments, they can feel more reassured and be able to explain it to themselves and others.
That's really well put, because that's exactly my intention, is to be their best friend so they can feel comfortable and confident in themselves and face a world just as ignorant about this topic, and be able to be okay within themselves, and also be in a position to be patient with people who don't know about it and who are throwing up their defenses. There's an awful lot of dissent and frustration. It's like the nutrition world is kind of like the political world. It's very contentious.
Yeah, absolutely. And almost a religion in some ways.
Definitely. And unfortunately, a lot of the folks who are the opposite of carnivore, and in just anytime you join a club and put a label on your lifestyle and your diet choice, you're running the risk of losing perspective about what's the point.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. That's why I think labels can be helpful and they can simplify things and provide frameworks for people. But really, you want to try to individualize your diet and see what works well for you. And that's why I'm always advocating experimentation and keeping an open mind and these things. And Sally, one thing I just loves you telling this story, and I think it's really revealing for people and a great kind of case study in oxalate. Can you talk about tea, its oxalate content, and the effect on high tea drinking countries like in the UK? I just found that so interesting when I heard you mention it.
Yeah. Tea is really interesting because the original oxalic acid diatheses, which was the original diagnosis of this oxalate toxicity that we're seeing now, was known in England in the mid 1800s, and it was associated with rhubarb season. Rhubarb was this big deal in England. It became this popular thing among the elites. And they used the horse manure from the streets to heat greenhouses so they could grow rhubarb earlier and started in the fall and get it so they could have a harvest at Christmas time, and rhubarb tarts became a Christmas thing. But before all that, rhubarb was like a spring thing. But they noticed whenever rhubarb season started, depending on whether it was the era of the greenhouses, which was a huge deal in England, right after rhubarb season, they'd start seeing weird stuff with intestinal obstruction problems and other illnesses and pains. And they figured out this oxalic diatheses, that people who were prone to it, if they did the rhubarb thing, they would get sick with it. And then we'd teach them to not eat the high oxalate foods, what we knew. I mean, we only had limited understanding about how to measure oxalate in foods. It's very tough science. It's amazing they did as well as they did back in the late 1800s. But I think what was going on there was really the English doctors identifying this condition and bringing it forward in the field of medicine. And at the time, in the 1800s, England, France, Germany, mostly England and France were major leaders in science and health sciences. And the US took a while to catch up. And so there was this debate, what is this oxalic diatheses and is it real and so on. And it was real to the country that was the tea drinking country, and less real in France that was wine and brie, different diet style. So I think the tea, you're drinking tea multiple times a day. I think it's quite customary at the time to drink at least 4 cups of tea a day. That would be 100 milligrams of oxalate on average. 4 cups a day, or 5 would be, 125 or something in that range. Then you add in your potatoes, which you're eating routinely, and then you add in rhubarb on top of that in the spring, and suddenly you're sick. Whereas in the countries that weren't drinking the tea, you don't see it. Now, tea is an infusion, and the infusion pulls out the soluble oxalate. So when you drink this, the oxalates you're drinking in tea is 100% soluble. So those little ions of oxalic acid easily get absorbed into the body. Of course, and tea comes with a lot of other polyphenols and tannins and these sort of phytonutrients, which can be phytotoxins and can be also problematic. So the interesting thing about tea is that I see in my clients that it really affects them. They get irritable bladder and so on. And sometimes we can use tea, add a little tea to a carnivore diet to slow down the body's purging the attic, keep the body from trying to move too much oxalate out of the body too fast. Tea can sometimes be a good example of a food you can use and still maintain a low carb and, pretty carnivore diet, and add back a little oxalate as a medicinal dose to try to tell your body, hey, don't clear out the oxalate attic too fast.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I like how you contextualize it around other oxalate foods and how the cumulative effects can sneak up on you. And I guess one general question is, are there people for whom oxalate is more benign or who don't need to worry about oxalate, for lack of a better phrasing? Or is it just everyone should worry about it, but some people experience symptoms later?
Well, we definitely know that oxalate illnesses can be completely asymptomatic. And we know this because the genetic form of the disease, called primary hyperoxaluria, many of these patients have very few symptoms until they're near the end, until there's so much oxalate in their bones and things that they're falling apart. So we can't really use symptoms as a judgment for who's in trouble with oxalate and who's fine with oxalate. We really don't have any research or any way to measure it other than taking bone biopsies, and not everybody accumulates heavily in the bones. You may be accumulating heavily in your uterus or your epididymis or your thyroid gland or somewhere else. And so it's really hard even in tissue sampling. Of course, nobody's going in and pulling bones out of people. That's not going to happen. That's too invasive, and this is not established as such a common thing. So there's not a good way to reassure yourself. But the people who are most vulnerable to oxalate damage is anybody with gut issues. If you've got any degree of gut inflammation, if you've had IBS, bloating, indigestion, reflux, allergies, food sensitivities, any kind of toxicology, or, toxic issues, or, like high lead or high mercury, or if you've got obvious immune issues going on where you tend to be achy and suffer with arthritis or crankiness or poor sleep, then you may be a kind of person who's what we call a hyperabsorber. Anybody who's hyperabsorbing oxalate is in trouble with oxalate and will be. You see this post-bariatric surgery. So bariatric surgery pretty much guarantees that you're going to be a hyperabsorber of oxalate. That population tends to get in trouble with oxalate problems. We see that now with Al Roker, who's a weatherman who is famous for having bariatric surgery several years back.
Yeah, interesting.
And he's had like 4 joint surgeries, oxalate rupture joints, and he's now got prostate cancer. And from my research, there's several mechanisms upon which oxalate at the cellular level is promoting cancer development. So he didn't get the kidney stones. We tend to think of kidney stones as a sign that you have a high oxalate problem. Definitely true. If you've had a kidney stone, you need to chill your jets on the high oxalate foods. But it's a lot more than kidney stones, and you can have a high oxalate problem, which I believe Mr. Roker probably has, and not have kidney stones. So because there's all this diverse genetics, diverse ways of expressing the oxalate toxicity, there's not necessarily one flag except for these vulnerability areas. So gut health is key. Kidney health is key. If either one of those is compromised, you need to be worrying about oxalates. The other thing is if you're frail, have metabolic stress, metabolic syndrome, obesity, those are all kind of gut inflammation conditions. If you're elderly, if you're a baby, if you're a fetus, you want to be protected from oxalate. And I really feel strongly as a public health professional that we should take spinach and these high oxalate foods out of the hospital, out of the nursing homes, out of the daycare centers, and protect the vulnerable folks in our societies.
Yeah, it's scary how schools, nursing homes, jails, a lot of these armed forces, policemen really don't have control over their food choices. And from a public health perspective,
it's dreadful. It's a real punishment that's undeserved.
Yeah. Some of our most vulnerable populations too.
Yep.
And Sally, one thing I wanted to ask is about your current diet. I know before carnivore, you were doing low plant foods and lemon. You said you had dabbled with a vegan diet a long time ago. You tried carnivore. At one point, I know you were adding back in carbs. Can you talk about kind of that evolution and some of the whys behind it?
Sure. Yeah, this is really fun because the best part about the low oxalate diet is that it helps your body speak to you better. You can hear when your body dislikes a food a lot better when oxalate's out of your gut. It's amazing. So after you've been on a low oxalate diet for a while or carnivore diet for a while, and then you go add in too many cabbages or whatever, or too many salads because it's low carb, it seems healthy, it's Thanksgiving, I should have a big salad, right? your body will let you know that, hey, that's not really working for me. So I believe in listening to that. So that got me down to pretty much a carnivore diet, but I was still using lemon juice because lemon juice is such a powerful food for lowering inflammation and lowering oxalate problems, because the citric acid in lemon helps your body dissolve crystals, supports your kidneys, keeps your pH right so your kidneys can handle all that oxalate better. It's very helpful. And as we go through these cycles of clearing oxalate, juicing a lemon is amazingly good medicine. So I was doing like 4 or 6 lemons a day for a long, long time. And then when I went full carnivore in April of, I think it was 2019, I realized the lemons probably were making me inflamed. And so I decided I shouldn't do lemons anymore. So I cut those out and so on, and pretty much did a full carnivore diet, quit doing supplements and all that. And I found that I couldn't stay off. I found it put me in a bad place of fatigue, low production, feeling poor, to give up the supplemental supports which we need when you're toxic with oxalate. So I want people to feel okay. Like there's this, like we were saying before about the clubbishness. I got this label. I've got to be carnivore hard. I've got to be perfect. I'll just water, meat, and no supplements. We're not all okay, always such a well-being that we can get by without supports. So I went back on supplements and also found that I wasn't doing well that summer when I met you at Keto Fest. I was really struggling with leg cramps and problems with sleeping and just these issues. And the only thing that seemed to fix it was getting carbs back in. So I relaxed about carbs enough to, do my coconut water for potassium and a little bit of carbs, and at the time playing around with mango and so on. So anyway, as you keep healing your metabolism and you keep getting your nutrition right, eventually you can do better with generating muscle glycogen and generating blood glucose. But a lot of us who are oxalate damaged are terrible at that, because the enzymes that make glycogen and glucose are broken because oxalate has bound the cofactors on those enzymes. And that's at an intimate place in your mitochondria. You don't have enough control over calcium and where it is in the cell, enough control over magnesium and where it is in the cell. And these enzymes that run your metabolism are broken. And it takes a long time of getting oxalate out of your body to get oxalate to stop doing that, because even though you're not eating it anymore, oxalate is still hanging around. So as I get stronger and stronger, I feel, I'm basically a steak and ground beef eater. I mean, I live on warmed up ground beef. I live on hamburgers. I live on steaks and beef roasts and pork, and do big pork roasts here and there. I eat a lot of water with minerals and salt in it, and a lot of meat, and occasionally a couple times a month, some white rice and a little bit of like treats, or a little bit of a dried ring of pineapple. When my body tells me I need some carbs, it's usually because I'm not sleep. Once I don't sleep at night, my system is needing a little carb boost. And so I just listen to my body, try to keep my dietary life simple and enjoyable. But it's pretty much carnivore with a few little add-ins just to keep me in top shape.
Yeah, it sounds incredibly intelligent. I like how you're divorced from the dietary dogma of labels, and have been open to experimentation, but using the science to make an informed approach to experimentation and finding what works really well for you. I think more people would do really well to do that. So that's awesome.
Yeah, I really want to free people up. I'm not a big joiner of nutrition clubs. I never have been. I never will be, but I'm sort of creating my own little club here by trying to support people. And there's a whole bunch of us who are kind of post-oxalate survivors who are going through this 10-year process of recovery. And I like to feel that I'm helping us find each other and bond and huddle in a hugging supportive mass going, hey, it's okay. We can get through this.
Yeah. That's great. I think that's what a lot of people need. And where can people find out more about oxalate? What are some resources you would recommend? Obviously the book, once it comes out, I'm thrilled to read it myself and share it with my audience. But before then, like both your own great work and others, where can people dive into this topic and educate themselves?
Yeah. There's online resources. I've tried to make my website a resource for folks. There's a lot of free information there. If you go to the shop and download tabs in my website, there's quite a few free documents, including a couple of articles I wrote. The VP Foundation was the real modern originators of bringing back acid diatheses, but they didn't understand it quite that way. But they're out there as something you could support. If you have a little extra cash, you might want to join them and keep them going, because the VP Foundation is really a lot of why I know about oxalate and why Susan Owens, who's been a great leader and an innovator in this area, knows about oxalate, and the work of Dr. Clive Solomons, who is deceased now, but Susan Owens is supporting folks on a Facebook group with several moderators, and there's lots of people there and lots of conversations going on there, and they have some resources there. But I really think some of the stuff on my site is a little bit more directed and simplified. So you might start there and then start exploring the world of the conversations about, or the conversations among folks who are recognizing that it's severely impacted their health.
Yeah, I'll certainly link to all of those in the show notes, and those are great resources. I've dove into a few of them myself, and I think your website is fantastic, Sally. So thank you again so much for taking the time to chat with me today on New Year's Eve. It's really fun, and I think folks will really enjoy this episode. I encourage them to go and check out the first one too, and look forward to the book.
Thank you. If I may just throw in one last thought.
Please.
We're entering 2021. The whole thing of those of us who are discovering the oxalate piece in our health, there's a lot of emotions around that, disappointments and disorientation and this feeling of uncertainty and fear. And that's a lot of what 2020 was about for us human race on the planet in general. And the real answer, the benefit, the gift of these difficulties, whether they're the joint ones or the personal journey with oxalate, is it's an opportunity to come home, really come back to your place of yourself and learning to be with yourself no matter what's going on, and find a nurturing, loving way to be.
Yeah, that's a great message to end on. I think that's an excellent reflection that all of us can learn from for 2021. The world is in a very divisive place right now, and we need more of that. So thank you again, Sally, and I hope you have a great 2021. Happy New Year and a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Happy New Year to you and all your listeners.
Thank you. If you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the Carnivore Cast on Patreon. By becoming a patron, you'll help us reach more people and continue to create content on Carnivore. There are also exclusive perks available, such as private Q&As, consultations with me, and more. Become a supporter at patreon.com/carnivorecast. Check the episode description for the link. Thank you, and I'll see you there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Carnivore Cast. If you enjoyed this episode, please review on iTunes. It really helps us out, and share it with a friend. What questions would you like answered, or who would you like to hear from in the carnivore research community? You can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at CarnivoreCast, or go to carnivorecast.com. You can also email me at info@carnivorecast.com. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep it carnivore.